Today, how to save at least 6 communities from bankers' Bastardry. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. This is a very important post, and I'm joined by Robbie Barwick. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin. This is an important post. It's urgent.
Yeah, the fuse is burning. I hadn't really appreciated just how dramatic the branch closures are and how many communities are frankly right on the brink.
Well, there's in the next fortnight, Martin, there's 6 communities in Australia that are going to lose their final bank. And when they do, they're going to be devastated. Now, I don't want to predict the death of those communities. That would be unfair to them, but they know how tough it's going to be. And there's no need for it. And of those six communities, they're a subset of 10 communities that are going to lose banks in the next fortnight. But 4 of those still have at least one more bank left in town. And that's a subset of 35 communities. 45. So there's 35 more communities that are on notice that they're going to lose their banks in the first half of next year. The banks have pulled out all the stops. We've discussed this in the last few weeks since the Regional Banking Task Force report came out. It's given them the green light to mass close these branches, and it's smashing regional communities right across Australia. It also has quite a big impact on the suburbs when they do it as well, but the suburbs have a few more options around. In these regional communities, they often don't have any options around, and it is devastating. And we need the Australian people to respond to this and help us intervene this week. So we've launched a mobilisation this week, a last-ditch effort to try and get action here. Use these 6 as the example of what the government needs to do to stand up to the banks, because Jim Chalmers can pick up the phone and put the banks back in their place. And that's what we need people to do. By us picking up the phone and demand he do that, and let's see if we can get some action on these 6 towns this week.
Absolutely critical, and it's worth underscoring, isn't it, that some of the proposed closures are to do with the floods. So basically, communities have been inundated, and now the banks are not reopening. But others, it's just, well, frankly, bastardry, because basically the banks have decided they're going to leave. And whilst they say, well, of course, everybody can do digital out in regional land, digital doesn't work. There are many people who are going to be significantly disadvantaged, but more broadly, people who need to handle cash have nowhere to go. And of course, they're saying, well, of course, you can always use Bank at Post, except that Bank at Post aren't geared up to be able to do this. And it's a whole bunch of consequences that are come from this. And we know from all our research that if you take banking services away from a community, the community is more likely to strangle and die rather than thrive. This is critical.
It is critical. And just back to what you said, on the online banking, it doesn't work in digital Australia, in regional Australia. It's not as reliable. Plus, the banks are not telling the truth. Now, I've been meaning to say this the last few times we've done a show, because this is part of the war on cash. You and I, and we work with John Adams, and our Citizens Party's been big involved in that. We've been fighting the war on cash for 3 or 4 years now, right? And we stopped the government's cash ban. This is all part of that same picture. The government can't legislate we've stopped the government from legislating to ban cash, but they're letting the banks get rid of cash, right? And the public have to take that into their soul. This is why these 6 communities we're going to talk about, it's part of that fight. It is what affects you, right? If we allow the banks to keep doing this, because the bank's own figures show that people are using the branches. They're not moving on to online as much as they like to say they are. So one of the things I want people to do as a general thing, send it to the Citizens Party's email or my email. If you go to a bank and you're in a queue, take a photo of the queue. I've been hearing a lot about long bank queues now, right? Because the banks have been, even the branches they're keeping open, they're reducing the number of tellers, etc. And for a long time there, the queues were pretty short in banks. They were getting bigger at post offices. Now I'm hearing the queues of banks are growing bigger again. Let's get photos of bank queues and we'll start a campaign and start putting photos of bank queues all up over social media and show that these banks are lying. Right? I want to. If you see a bank queue, take a photo, share it with the Citizens Party, share it with me. If you're follow me on Twitter or whatever. Let's get this out there. Let's start people realizing there are people, by definition, who need to go and use a bank branch. That's why they're lined up in the queue. If they had an alternative, they wouldn't, right? But they need to. And the banks are, they're trying to deny that kind of reality. So that's something that we can do, but that's not the main game today. But just bear that in mind, all right? Let's start a campaign on that. Martin, I wanted to go through the names of these communities because people need to understand where they are and who they're fighting for, right? And you're fighting for everyone. This is for all Australia, but these communities are on the front line. These are the 6 that are being sacrificed to bankers' bastardry in the next fortnight. So they are the Bombala National Australia Bank in New South Wales. That's closing in 2 days on the 8th of December. That's the Dysart National Australia Bank in Queensland. That's closing on the 15th of December. There's 2 in Western Australia. Price Westpac is closing on the 16th of December. And Wongan Hills Westpac is closing on 16th of December. And then there's 2 in South Australia. The Mannum BankSA, Bank South Australia, except that's a subsidiary of Westpac. So don't be fooled by that. That's Westpac. That's closing on the 16th of December. And Yankalilla BankSA, also Westpac, is closing on the 9th of December. So in 3 days' time, essentially on Friday. And on top of that, the 4 branches that are going to close that still have that are not the last bank in town is 2 in WA, Collie, the Westpac at Collie, and the Westpac at Bridgetown. But let's get this about Bridgetown, Martin. There's still a Bank West in town, which is Commonwealth Bank, right? So Westpac's pulling out, Commonwealth Bank's still there. But coinciding with Westpac pulling out, Commonwealth Bank has just told the locals that they're cutting trading hours down to 3 days a week or something, and 3 half days a week, something like that. So they're going to be the last bank in town, and at that rate, they're going to be leaving soon as well. Westpac in Vincentia, if I pronounce that right, in New South Wales, that's closing on the 9th of December. And Laidley National Australia Bank is closing on the 8th of December. None of these closures are warranted. None of these closures are actually necessary. It's all about the way the banks account for these things. And the worst part is these are banks that are living fat off the taxpayers' teeth. They are massively subsidized by the public, these banks. They're 4 privileged businesses that are not allowed to go bankrupt. So here's the thing. Jim Chalmers, if the bank was going to close, Martin, the treasurer, Jim Chalmers, would stop the bank. If CBA or Westpac or NAB or ANZ was in trouble, he would intervene and save them. We're telling Jim Chalmers, call the bank's bluff and intervene to save the communities that they're supposed to be serving through these branches. That's what we need the Australian people to get fired up and do.
Absolutely. And this is not something which we can kick off till next year, right? This is something which is hitting communities day in, day out. And I think it must be sort of 70, 80, 90 branches now that have disappeared in recent times
this
across
year,
the country. Yep.
This year, there was 121 last year.
Yep.
So in the last 5 or 6 years, like there's been hundreds and hundreds. Like the rate has been dramatic in the last 5 or 6 years, but the rate since the 30th of September this year has broken all records, right? 73 have announced closures just since in those 7 weeks, as we talked about in one of our recent conversations, right? So the banks have the green light to do this now. And this is going to come down to the commitment of politicians to the public good, right? There must be a trade-off. There must be reciprocity. These banks must not be allowed to get away with sucking up huge amounts of taxpayer subsidies and not maintaining services. Now, we have an alternative. It's the perfect win-win alternative, right? We want to create a government post office bank in every post office in Australia, 4,300 post offices. And that will stop these banks from shutting branches because they'll have to compete with it. Instead of sending their customers to the post office to continue banking with them through Bank at Post, they may risk losing their customers to the bank, to the post office bank, right? Watch them change their policy then. But Martin, that campaign is going to take time, right? We need to save these banks now. And this is one of those issues where, because it's so clear cut, it's time for the public to saddle up and call the treasurer. So we're going to provide the numbers down below, but we need you to call the treasurer and the 6 federal MPs for those towns that are losing their banks. And when you call the federal MP, your message to the federal MP is, this is unacceptable. He must call the treasurer and demand that the treasurer take this up with the banks. And when you call the treasurer's office, we've got 2 numbers, his electorate office and his parliament office, call Jim Chalmers and demand that he take on the banks, that he use his authority as the treasurer, who knows how much these banks rely on him, to say, hey, cut it out. The banks, I think you and I talked about this, didn't we? The banks 2 weeks ago, the treasurer, this treasurer and the assistant treasurer, Stephen Jones, had agreed that to pass a law that would allow bank executives to be fined for ripping off their customers. And the day after that was announced, the banks called up this treasurer and demanded he drop it, and he did. Right? They do that sort of thing all the time. It's time for this treasurer to pick up the phone and call them and say, cut this out. Right? And he's only going to do that if he gets enough heat from the public. So this is about saving towns. Now, this may not work, but I tell you now, what we do this week and next week will lay a foundation for really taking this issue up in the new year around these other towns. Right? There's no, you and I, just for the sake of the viewer, Martin and I are working closely with Dale Webster, who's providing all the information on this. She's done so much work, the independent journalist Dale Webster. And we're working with some pretty fired up CEOs of councils who are desperate to save their towns, right? So we've got all sorts of ideas of how to do that. These councils are supporting our campaign for a postal bank, etc. But in the meantime, they can't let their towns wither and die on the vine, right? So there's lots of things in the works, and we'll unveil more as we go along. But for now, this requires public action. It requires heat from the public. Hit the phones, call the treasurer, and let him have it. Ask the treasurer, who does he serve? Anna Bligh, his close confidant, the head of the Banking Association, or the people in these communities that are about to be smashed? That's the question you, the public, should be asking the Treasurer of Australia, Jim Chalmers. Mr. Nice Guy, Jim Chalmers. Put some real heat on him. Who do you serve? Your mate Anna Bligh, the head of the Banking Association, or the people in these communities that her cronies in the banks are about to smash?
It's worth saying, isn't it, Robbie, that in the UK, there is currently a debate about enforcing access to cash through the banking system and making sure that people can actually do the things they need to do. We're way off the pace relative to some other countries.
Why aren't we learning from these debates over there? We've talked about this before. All of Europe is in uproar about this. They've had to legislate the other way. It's ridiculous. We are the most vulnerable country in the world when it comes to this stuff because of our size and low population density. And yet we are allowing that. I mean, they don't just close the branch; they rip out the ATMs, Martin.
Yes.
What bastardry is that? What absolute bastardry! These, they cost us money. We had a senator's aide tell us how they're talking in one state about, well, maybe the government should be able to subsidise these ATMs. No, they're already subsidised massively by the government. I remember when they brought in ATMs, they encouraged us all onto plastic cards. I'm a little bit older. I mean, that's showing my age. But that was a way for the banks to save money. Now they all moved us onto plastic cards and have to use ATMs, and they're ripping them out, right? Because now they want us all in totally digital, where they can literally control everything. They want to see every bit of money we spend, how we spend it. They want the data. They want the cut from that, right? And the worst part is the government knows how much these banks depend on them, and they're letting it happen. Now, here's a story. We should tell this story about ANZ. You mentioned the the case of the flood victims, right? We're talking about the town of Seymour. So I'm in Melbourne. Seymour's an hour up the road. I'm in the northern suburb of Melbourne. Our office is in Coburg. I live in Glenroy, which is a suburb north. The next suburb is Broady, and the next suburb above that is Roxburgh Park. So Seymour gets smashed by floods, which is an hour up the road, one of the main towns on the Hume Freeway going to Albury. And the bank itself also gets a bit damaged, right? So the bank closed. And then ANZ used that as the excuse just in the last week or so to announce to the people of Seymour, we're not reopening the branch. Sorry. And then use all the other excuses they've got. People are going digital, etc. So then we got informed of a case where a businessman in the town who needed to bank his cash takings, because the only way he's been able to do business in the flood is by taking cash anyway, but that's his normal way of doing business, but he's got to bank it. So the ANZ tell him, you got to go to Roxburgh Park, the next local branch, ANZ branch, which is in a shopping centre at Roxburgh Park. We call it Roxy. So he has to come an hour all the way down the freeway to Roxy to do his banking. He gets to Roxy with his cash, his bag of cash. He goes into the branch and they say, sorry, we don't take cash on Tuesdays. What the?
Which, by the way, the question there is, can they legitimately hold a banking license?
Exactly.
If they don't provide those services.
They're not a bank on Tuesday.
Yeah.
They're a schizophrenic bank. We're not a bank on Tuesday. This is garbage. This is utter garbage what these banks... So they said to him, you got to go to Broady, which is the next suburb down. So he goes to Broady, and I know where that ANZ is. He goes into the shopping centre at Broady, would have had to line up. And then he's told, sorry, you need to email ahead to be able to deposit cash. Now, this guy lost it, apparently. And when he lost it, blew up, as you would. Remember, he's a businessman in Seymour. He doesn't want to even be in Melbourne, right? And he's being screwed around by these bureaucrats and these bankers in these banks. So when he lost it, the manager came out. And to show you how arbitrary this garbage is, the manager actually said, all right, we'll take the cash, right? Now, this is just multiply that story by thousands and thousands and thousands of times right around Australia. All right, that's the kind of frustration in infuriating circumstances people are dealing with all the time. For how are they allowed to get away with it?
Right? And it's worth saying, Robbie, isn't it, that people who are already in difficult positions, flooding and everything else, this extra imposition is just way beyond, the mark. And the other point, just to re-emphasize, in an emergency when electricity goes down, if you're digital, you're stuffed. I mean, look what happened through the bushfires down the south coast. You have to be able to continue using cash services, and there are so many businesses and regional communities that still are reliant on trading with cash. Yeah. So they're strangling those communities. They're putting barriers left, right, and centre. And frankly, none of the CEOs of those big four banks care a damn about this, and that's disgraceful.
And think about the story we just went through about our poor man from Seymour and ANZ. Martin, remember when banks first started putting restrictions on cash withdrawals? I mean, I remember our office would get calls. People were shocked. And actually, it really came to the fore around the time of the global financial crisis when people were pretty motivated to withdraw their money from the bank. And suddenly they're being told, you're not allowed to. We sort of became used to that. And then $10,000 limits and all this sort of stuff, right? Got to notify the bank. Yeah, we've gradually, the frog in the warm water, we've become accepting of that. I just told you a story about a guy who wasn't allowed to deposit cash. Not withdrawing, deposit cash. And so, look, there's the thousands of people watching this show. Please do not say, that's an interesting side issue, but that's not my particular issue. This is everyone's issue. If we don't draw a line in the sand And given that we as taxpayers have the authority to demand these banks act socially responsibly, screw this idea of them operating commercially. They're lying to you. They are commercial. They're banks. They bloody make money in the sense of invent money, right? Screw all that stuff. Don't believe their arguments for a second. This is about acting responsibly. Every citizen, the way you're supposed to act responsibly when you go out, you know there's a social obligation on you. You can't do everything that you absolutely want to do. You can't take your clothes off and run down the street and piss everywhere and do all that sort of stuff, right? Everybody knows they have to act responsibly. There's 4 businesses that don't. And when I challenged ANZ about the Seymour case yesterday, they were gushing on Twitter. Oh, please, thank you for your feedback. This will help us improve. It made me want to vomit. And I gave them a serve and said, stop it. Stop talking this way. This is sickening to the people. The only way you can improve is to reopen your branch, right? But this is what it is for everybody. So you may not be affected by the branch. You may not live in a regional town. Most of you won't live in these 6 towns. But if you know people who do, share this video with them. You may not be immediately affected. You may think that you live in the CBD, one of the capital cities, and you won't be affected. But you're affected by the arrogance of these banks. You're affected by the fact that they think that they are a special privileged business and they can do what they want. They have no social obligation, and they know they get away with thinking that because the politicians let them. And so the only way we can change that is if the public bring force to bear on these politicians and say, no, you are the elected officials in this country. The 1937 Banking Royal Commission said the government is the ultimate authority in the economy over the financial system, not the banks, right? You show some backbone and make these banks serve the people of Australia, or else what they're good for. What are they good for? Nationalise them. Ben Chifley was not a communist. He tried to nationalise the banks precisely because of this kind of bastardry, right? If they're not going to serve the people of Australia, you may as well nationalise them. You have a national system for commercial banks, and if you want to be an investment bank, go and do that on the private, on your own dime, right? Now, we're not calling for that, but there has to be some kind of authority over it. It's got to come with you making a phone call. So we might be able to really stir the pot this week and put the acid on Jim Chalmers. And that's why these calls are important. So we've got basically 7 calls for you to make. Those MPs in those towns, covering those towns, and Jim Chalmers. And when you call Jim Chalmers, you deliver a hard message. Remember you're talking to his assistant or whatever on the phone. So don't take it all out on her or him. But make sure that the message you leave for Jim Chalmers is very pointed. He has to pick up the phone and demand the bank stop doing this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have to get the political machine in action. And the only way to do that is force of voice.
Yes.
So democracy in action once again. So pick up the phone, send the emails, make sure that he understands that this is a critical issue. He does, I'm sure, but, doesn't understand the consequences. So it's really critical. And this is a burning platform. So do it today.
Yes.
Don't leave it till the weekend. Do it straight away.
Make the calls straight away. Make them tomorrow. Make them release this week. There's some of the banks I went through don't close till the end of next week, right? Please commit to making these 7 calls. And if you want to, we'll provide a link to all the senators. If you're really fired up and you can, call a lot more people. Even call the big 4 banks and try and call their corporate headquarters and get through to the CEO's office. Give them a serve as well, right? We'll put the list of banks that we're talking about down below, or rewind through the video and freeze them where they are, where we go through the list. Give them a call as well, right? It's basically the big 4. All the big 4 are doing this. Demand they stop shutting their branches. Let's give them some pushback.
Yeah, Robbie, we'll get that out straight away. Put the list and things below, and we'll update the community later as to how we're going. There will probably be more stories that we will need to tell over the next few days, because this is a fast-moving event, and we've got a few other plans up our sleeve, haven't we?
Yeah, and people should tell their stories below, Martin, in the comments. You've got your own stories, tell them. All right, we need lots of feedback.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Martin.
See you later.